Thank you, everyone, for your patience. We're going to start in about 1 minute. We just got everything worked out. Let's see. Okay, we are ready to go. Thank you, everyone. A little bit getting our technical issues resolved today, so a few minutes late, but so we're just going to move very quickly and get right into it with Dr. Bradley. Appreciate everyone being here. We are hoping to preserve the knowledge of how to preserve our nation. That is why we do these classes. There is a great need for more people that are educated and then that are interested in taking action. And we hope to empower people with the tools they need to take action. And so these classes help us master the foundational knowledge that we need. And out of 1,000 things that you learn, there may be just like 2 or 3 things that is the right thing that a county councilman needs at the right moment or that the city council needs. And it takes building that foundation of knowledge for ourselves and for our community to understand when, hey, we're violating Republican form in our city by passing this ordinance or by signing that deal with, the Federal River Protection Commission or whatever it is. And many of our most local representatives, people get into office and there is no official training on the Constitution or how to actually follow the law. They're empowered to write laws that we're supposed to follow, but yet they're never trained in the law that they're supposed to follow. So the remedy for that is that the culture of the people in this nation, they have to have, there has to be a reservoir of knowledge in our country so that we can hold our representatives accountable. And a little bit more specifically, that's kind of a general thing. The people preserve liberty because of their understanding of it. That's why Benjamin Franklin said, you have to keep the republic. But taking that to the next level, Defending Utah publishes this manual, the American Committees Association, and it's where we want to create just small local, you could call them institutions in every nation, every city across the nation, if we could. But in your local communities, you need to create these local kind of pockets of true understanding of people that study the Constitution. The founders called them committees of safety. Okay, and committees of correspondence, just committees of the people that are self-governing. When you have that body and you follow the steps that we've outlined, the idea is that you can preserve the knowledge, and there's always someone to teach the local representatives. And it's a very difficult task to teach our state legislature and our congressmen. It's so politically charged, but in your local towns and your local cities, I've been surprised how often there are real opportunities, and we miss those opportunities because of the lack of the knowledge, because of the lack of the organization. So anyway,
Is Riverton's getting rid of fluoridated water?
oh, that's great. Yeah. So that's a nice little win. So anyway, so I'm gonna turn the time over to Scott so we can get into it. Today he's gonna do part 3 of religious liberty, and we've been going deep on this. And today he's gonna tell us a little bit more about how that's happening and how we're losing that, and hopefully we can be motivated to stand up for that a little more and be a little more educated on what we can do about it. And all that being said, I will do one quick plug. Next month, we are going to do a health solutions symposium. This is an event that we've done a couple times that have always been pretty popular. And we have some out-of-town guests that are going to talk about freedom-related health solutions that are pretty cool. So just watch your emails for that. Okay, Scott, I'll invite you to come up. Thank you.
Let's get this in place. Are we okay here? Is the next month meeting you just announced going to take the place of this meeting, or will be another time?
It will be, okay. Yeah, next month it's going to be March 15th. And so
March 15th for those in the ether world.
yeah. And so it will be March 15th. It will be here. And just join our mailing list at defendingutah.org if you click on the link, and we'll give you more information. But I think we'll probably skip this meeting next month because it's going to be 2 meetings in a row otherwise.
Oh, yeah, we couldn't have that.
Yeah.
No.
Just a lot to organize. So I think we'll skip one boot camp, let you regroup after all the First Amendment stuff, and then kind of plan the next boot camp.
Wonderful.
Okay.
We're good to go. All right. Well, as Enoch mentioned, this is the third in the series to do the religious liberties piece. Now, unfortunately, I usually like to do religious liberties in 6 meetings, and I don't have this one in it because, there is so much about religious liberties. It's essential. It is a foundational issue to being able to maintain our liberty. So we're doing 3, which normally we won't do as we're going through the Bill of Rights. We're not going to spend this length of time on each little segment of the Bill of Rights. It's going to be, I'll say superficial, don't call it that in your own mind, but it's going to be enough that you'll feel good about jumping in. And if you want to learn more, great. Or if you want to use it as a foundation for your understanding of the Bill of Rights, that'll be great too. We will go with the Bill of Rights components much less in depth, although this is still much less in depth, but it's something we should move on from. Remember that when we first started the Bill of Rights with the religious liberties aspect, we talked about what is religious liberty. The next time we talked about what happens if you lose it. And this time we're going to talk about something that I'm quite confident will be very uncomfortable to many people. And it's because it's a good example of a bad example. And it's a little bit pointed, in fact. You could do this, you could say, well, the Pope said this or something like that. Well, we're in Utah. And we have a magnificent example of how religions and government can collaborate to destroy religious liberty. What? Are you talking to me? Are you saying? No. Say it ain't so. But 10 years ago, and the principal religion of this state and the state legislature collaborated in an effort to bring about something that was destructive of religious liberties and personal rights. And the problem is religions very often begin to believe that religion is the institution. It's not. Religion as an institution owes its existence to the individual God-given right. Did you hear that? Individual God-given right. We're going to say it a couple of times in here, that individuals and their ability to worship their God is the basis of religion. Religious institutions come into existence because people that band together and have a belief system. I believe in this God, or you believe in that God, or whatever, and sooner or later, there's an institution that grows out of that. The institution has its religious liberty because you individually have religious liberty. And I want the institution to have religious liberty. I mean, in fact, I cherish that principle. But when the institution believes or comes to act as if the institution is preeminent, then we get into trouble. And I'm very concerned what happened, and this, as you can see on this little slide, it's a review of Senate Bill, SB stands for not Scott Bradley, Senate Bill, okay? I didn't come up with this. Senate Bill 296 that was enacted 10 years ago in the Utah legislature. And it was a combined, vigorous effort by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Some people call them Mormons, some people call them LDS. You know what I'm talking about, and people out there reviewing this from across the land. This is not to promote or deny or to disparage or anything, any bit of anything. It's to point out how sometimes misimpressions have damaging side effects. And the reason I chose this one, I could have gone and used some things that were a little bit more strenuous to make the connection on, where some religion or another might have gotten involved in some other aspect of the country, but because this is my home state, and because the predominant religion has a lot of influence at our legislature, in spite of the fact they claim they don't, and the legislature claims they don't either, they do. And so it makes a really fine example of a bad example. And that's why I used it. And I'm going to use the leadership of the LDS Church, their own statements that promote the idea, largely, that I'm trying to promote, that it's individual, it's God-given. And yet, they flipped when this opportunity came up. And so I use their positioning not to try and promote one church leader's name over another or anything like that, but to say, this is what their doctrine says. This is what it says in their scriptures. They quote their own scriptures, and then they do something that's very damaging. And it's interesting to me that when I went up to the legislature 10 years ago, every time I went up to testify against this particular bill, I was testifying in opposition to some very senior leadership in the church. And it's like, you know, I really like you guys, but it was kind of a hard scenario to be in because of the dynamic that is presented. And people got in line and passed this without hardly a negative word. And I felt really badly about it. And it stands today, and it's very destructive. And I hope you can see as we go through this, that those that believe in liberty understand this as an individual God-given right. The American Founding Fathers did, and it appears that the LDS Church, based upon their doctrinal statements, should understand this, and yet they became whole hog and completely in favor of this, which destroys two things: individual right to property and individual right to religion. But they maintained their own, shall we say, dignity, when they protected themselves while they threw everybody else under the bus. Now, I've got a pretty long history that we could go into that goes back decades. When a good friend of mine, back in the 70s, probably longer than most of you have been on the earth, right? He was in the legislature, and he literally wept almost every night when he came home because of what the church was doing to protect its institutional interests while they were destroying and undermining other fundamental interests. He's a good, solid guy, loved him like a brother or a father or an uncle or whatever you want to call it, loved him like family. He's dead now, and so he's gone on to his reward. But this has been going on for decades. And 10 years ago, a decade ago now, it seems like it was just yesteryear, we had this come up, and it's such a good example of a bad example that I felt like I had to use it. It's not meant to disparage anything, it's to point out things that could and should be corrected. Because without our individual God-given rights, we will not maintain the institution's religious liberty. The institution will ultimately and finally, I'm not just talking about the LDS Church, I'm talking about Catholics, Methodists, Baptists, every religious institution that's there will finally say, oops, where did that go? Because the individual's individual God-given right has been cast off. We talked last time about how, shall we say, cultural drift leads to law. As people become more woke, let's say, we kind of tend to go with a more woke legal perspective. I will say this, if a religion gets into cultural drift and helps facilitate the cultural drift of the legal system, then we're really in trouble. And we talked last time about a 296-page Civil Rights Commission report that came out in September of 2016. Obama was the president, and their perspective was that they were going to reduce religious liberties to the most narrow band so that people could say, oh, you've got your religious, look, we protected these. But by so doing, they were going to accept all of these other cultural drift things where they were creating rights that required individuals to fulfill those rights. That's not a God-given right. If government creates a right that someone else has to fulfill, that is not really a true, as the Founding Fathers understood it, God-given right. That's a recent creation, a fabrication, and they wanted to be able to have their system encroach upon religious liberties to the point that, yeah, you can go to church if you want. You can pray in your home if you want. I may be overstating this just slightly right now, but don't you dare bring that perspective to your workplace, because these other people shouldn't have to be encroached upon in the workplace with your belief system. No, wait a minute. We talked about how expressing your religious belief was to be freely done without coercion or penalty. And Thomas Jefferson, for one, in his Religious Liberties Act of Virginia, that was passed in 1786, strongly believed that. Okay, so we've strayed far culturally as a government and our woke system, and so have churches. And when they collaborate, it becomes something that accelerates the destruction. Now we're ready to start. This is, like I say, it will be hard to say, did he say, and he said that, and this scripturally, and they did, and this is what the outcome was. It hurts. It hurts when you say, some people that you might have respect for and care about and everything seem to be easily drifted. Maybe they don't do it easily, and maybe they do it for their own purposes, but it still doesn't fit the Founding Fathers' perspective. So, back 10 years ago, Senate Bill 296, called Religious Liberties and Anti-Discrimination. Okay, the advocates said they sought to create a bill that protected religious liberties while preventing discrimination against sexual orientation. Well, that sounds like an admirable thing to do, but if they were really designing it to do that, they absolutely failed. And they didn't do the first constraint. The first constraint was protecting religious liberties, as you say there. They did a pretty good job on the other side. In fact, they overbalanced the scale on that other side, and we'll see that shortly. Individual property rights, conscience, and religious liberties are destroyed by this bill. And it's still legal application in the state of Utah, and it's carried out. And it's interesting. You're going to have to kind of remember to put pieces in slots, maybe, that you can put it back together again. It's kind of like a puzzle. You get pieces and you start to see if kind of a shape or a coloration scheme or an image or something that's in there, and you add to it until you're finally done with your picture when you're doing puzzles. Well, you need to understand some things. They did class warfare in this even, where they said that the bourgeois, now you're going to see this term in a minute, it's a communist term about the landed middle class. Okay, if you have any means to yourself, now you're a bourgeois. Just think about that. And the proletariat were the working masses that were oppressed. Okay, they kind of took that view with this, in that if you had 4 apartments, you had to lose all of those rights that you have to discern who or why or if you're going to rent anybody. Well, so if you're a little bit more well-to-do and have 4 apartments, so they took away some rights from you. But if you're like my father was, and he's passed away now, but if you're like my father and he had a basement apartment and he wanted to rent it out to someone, he wasn't put upon by this egregious violation of personal rights unless, because he was 90 years old, he says, I don't want to have to go through the hassle of renting this to somebody and doing contracts and looking at possible people to rent my property. I'm going to turn it over to a professional. I'm going to ask a professional real estate agent to rent my property for me. Even though he had only 1 basement apartment, if he did that, he too lost his rights. And he had to rent according to the law. And if you had an institution or a business or something that you had over a certain size, you had to have those rights taken from you. So it was kind of a class warfare kind of thing, along with losing private property and along with losing religious liberties. And it was and is a violation of some very fundamental truths, where we have gone into drift and think we can take private property if it's a good enough reason. We can withhold your conscience if we want, but we're going to find that the constitutions allow you to have freedom of conscience. And it says it specifically in the Utah Constitution. It says it specifically about private property in the Utah Constitution. I had a Utah senator that served probably 30 years in the Utah Senate say the Utah Constitution doesn't have anything to do with private property. Let's look at Article 1. I mean, let's just open this up and take a look. What we find is that the people that are making our laws do not think it's important. They say, well, we don't take their property, for crying out loud. But if you take control of their property, that's a takings also. So people need to understand, we'll fit these pieces together, we hope, as we go through this. But you've got to be able to say, oh, that what he said to begin with, now I see where it fits. And put that in the puzzle piece. Okay. So this bill got it wrong on so many levels. Okay, we're going to review the bill from many perspectives. We're going to look at from the perspective of scriptures, ancient and modern, according to what the LDS Church holds doctrinally. We're going to look at the American Founding Fathers' mentors. We're going to look at the Founding Fathers. We're going to look at the United States Constitution. We're going to look at the Utah Constitution. We're going to look at the words of several more recent LDS leaders. Again, this is to show how we drift from what we say to what we do. And what we do really is what matters. You can give lip service to almost anything. But what you do, ultimately and finally, shows your true belief. And then we're going to talk about Marx and his Communist Manifesto. Wow, how can all these things blend together? That's going to be a tough course, isn't it? Okay, so we're going to also actually consider the wording that's in Senate Bill 296. It says it does not create special classes, okay? When in fact it really does. It contains protections for individuals with opposing viewpoints in the workplace. when in fact it does not. They said, we're going to protect what you want to do, but it doesn't protect you, okay? Unless you're in the favor of some gender bender interpretation, okay? But if you have a different position, it doesn't protect you. They say it claims and protects conscience and religion. Well, it doesn't. And it destroys the individual rights of conscience and religion as well as private property and your choices you make with your property and how you're going to use it. George Washington, and by the way, this is a plaque I have in front of me all the time when I'm sitting at my desk. I mean, this is kind of, if you will, a fundamental core value of mine, okay? And so whatever the subject, I try to think about it as George Washington did. He said there is but one straight course, and that is to seek truth and pursue it steadily. Then I said earlier, we were going to talk about how Thomas Jefferson said, I am a sect by myself as far as I know. He was a religion of one in his mind. I think he had a broader belief system than what he specifically said, but it's okay. You can be a religion of one. It doesn't matter. There's no critical mass. If there's 6 members of your belief system, or there's 6 billion, or well, there's not that many people on the earth, 6 million or 10 million or 15 or 20 million in your belief system, it doesn't matter. And it's interesting to me, by the way, I'll make a parenthetically comment here. Remember the COVID con 5 years ago? Okay, the death jab, the shot clot, the efforts that were made by many to say, this violates my conscience and my belief system. Dallin H. Oaks, who is currently a member of the First Presidency and the next guy in line to be in charge, said, anybody that says that is guilty of perjury. Huh? Huh? What are you talking about? Well, it's not the church's belief system. That doesn't matter, it's mine. It doesn't matter. Just because your particular institution does not have it written in concrete or in blood or whatever they want to call it, it's your belief system. And for him to say it's perjury is a very high legal standard that's worthy of conviction and imprisonment oftentimes. But Thomas Jefferson said he was a sect of one. And by the way, he and John Adams believed very similarly, although differently too, about some of the religious aspects. But religious liberty is not only in an institution, it's an individual God-given right. Institutions hold positions because people with a similar belief have banded together, and sometimes those at the head of an institution begin to act like they can define that. And that was what was going with the COVID con. Okay, so let's begin looking at the scriptures, ancient and modern. Okay, there's 10 commandments that we get out of Exodus 20. Okay, if you need to look it up in Exodus 20. There's a lot of other places that talks about it, but that's a good place to start. Okay, they're in government buildings. In fact, they're in the United States Supreme Court. This country has a very high level of religiosity that it's based upon. And these are etched in the stone of many government buildings in Washington, D.C., for example. And I've wandered the halls of many of those places, and I've found great solace in the fact that these magnificent principles that are foundational are etched in stone. And individuals that come to those places and argue otherwise need to just look on the wall. And there they are, you know. Wake up, people. This nation has a foundation that if we vary from it, we're going to lose it altogether. Okay, so 10 commandments are in there. Okay, let's talk about that. They're recognized as universally foundational to the principles the nation was established on. Let's look at Exodus 20:15. Thou shalt not steal. That's the 8th commandment. Okay. Wow. Do we violate that at every single turn and every single option? Every time USAID sends $1 billion to someplace overseas that they took from American public, or if they redistribute it to a corporation, or if they check and send it to a state, or if they put it into a county or municipality, or they send it to an individual, they're violating that commandment because by force they took it from others that it was not theirs to take. You say, well, you got to have taxes. Yeah, you do. But in the Declaration of Independence, it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They're endowed by their creator. So there's created and creator. That means something about a big guy in the universe, okay? I'm going to be very superficial about that, okay? It says they're endowed with certain inalienable rights. It mentions a few, and then it says it's the purpose of government to secure those rights. Private property is one of those rights. And so, if they're violating those rights as they go about their business, it's a pretty serious thing. Okay, let's look at Exodus 20:17. Thou shalt not covet. What's a covet? Lust after thy neighbor's house. Thy neighbor's wife. Oh, his manservant, his maidservant, his ox, his ass, or anything that is thy neighbor's. Okay, so you are not to look at it and say, I want that. I think it's probably okay to say, I'd like something like that if I can earn it and put my labor into it. But to think about it as taking it, you want it so badly, and if you take covetousness to the nth degree, it becomes a violation of the 8th commandment, thou shalt not steal. Okay, you can see how these things fit together. But if you look at those 2 commandments, fully 20% of the 10 commandments deal with the recognition and protection of private property. Okay? So let's go to an LDS scripture. Some of you will be familiar with this if you remember that faith. Others of you maybe have never even heard of this thing. But I think it's sound doctrine for anybody that wants to be free. So if there's something found scripturally in a religion that you're totally unfamiliar with, and it fits and it applies and it has value, it's worth considering. That's how I look at this. Okay, so let's look at Doctrine and Covenants 134, verses 1 and 2, and then we're going to go to 4, and then we're going to go to 5, over a few slides. We believe that governments were instituted of God for the benefit of man, and that he holds men accountable for their acts in relation to them, both in making laws and administering them for the good and safety of society. Verse 2, we believe that no government can exist in peace except such laws are framed and held inviolate as will secure to each individual the free exercise of conscience, the right and control of property, and the protection of life. The reason those are underlined in there is because this law that was passed in Utah does none of those things. Well, I guess they're not going to let anybody take your life over it. They may put you to some fine or penalty, but conscience and property are what is controlled by this law in regards to rentals and the workplace. Okay? Verse 4, we do not believe that human law has a right to interfere in prescribing laws of worship to bind the consciences of men, nor dictate forms for public or private devotion. Now, how does that fit? If your conscience says, I don't want to take the death jab, wait a minute. Human law can't bind these consciences. That the civil magistrate should restrain crime but never control conscience, should punish guilt but never suppress the freedom of the soul. You know what? You can believe a whole bunch of different things and it's okay. As long as you don't impose them by violence on somebody else, basically, okay? Or try and take their God-given rights. Okay, so conscience and right and control of property they play into God's acceptable form of government according to the LDS doctrine. Let's go to verse 5. We believe that all men are bound to sustain and uphold the respective governments in which they reside. There's not a period there. There's a comma. Okay, you don't have to uphold, if you live in a government that's repressive, it's not saying that you have a responsibility to uphold that. No, you don't. Okay? Because there's a comma, a linking concept that says, while protected in their inherent and inalienable rights by the laws of such governments, and that sedition and rebellion are unbecoming of every citizen thus protected. Wait. So they're saying if your rights, inalienable rights, and the governments are synergistic and protected together, you shouldn't resort to sedition and rebellion because you're pretty well, covered by the fact that God's giving you a chance to exercise your own agency. Okay, so I don't promote sedition and rebellion, okay? But based on the strength of this scriptural statement, it would seem that destruction of conscience or private property rights is so egregious that they are of the few violations that justify sedition and rebellion against an established government. By the way, if you stop and think about it, in another, and I didn't put this scripture in there, we can review it afterwards if you wish, but in the LDS doctrine, it's stated very directly that God raised up the men that he used to establish this nation, and he redeemed the land by the shedding of blood. Because they had lost those fundamental God-given principles to the point that they had to resort to blood. Now, we have a way to avoid that altogether, if we will. But he endorsed them. He gave him his wink and nod and said, go for it, boys. This is okay, because they're overstepping their bounds. Okay, so then let's look at the Article of Faith 11, which is one of many. As you might say, oh, there's at least 10 before that, if you haven't heard of these things. We claim the privilege of worshiping Almighty God according to the dictates of our own conscience, and allow all men the same privilege, let them worship how, where, or what they may. Now, wait a minute. Does this say the institution dictates your belief and how you worship? It says we claim, as in all of us claim, that we can worship God according to the dictates of our conscience. It's not perjury to say, I claim a religious exemption because the institution hasn't canonized it and authorized it and printed it and sent it out. This is a very individual thing. Okay. So, the essence of ownership is control. When we lose control, we effectively lose ownership. Okay, so, well, you can keep owning the property and paying the taxes, but we're going to tell you how you can use it. Can you see how that works? It's not a very happy thought. We testified one time here in the Salt Lake Valley before a large municipal council against something that they wanted to get through, and they ultimately prevailed. We came in and testified that they were slimy communists, basically, for what they were doing. And you know what? We got the crowd stirred up to the point that the council said, let's take a 15-minute recess and let a cooling off period happen. The people in the crowd were gathering their pitchforks and torches and so on. But the city council was going to do it, by damn, if you will. And I hate to use that term, but they were going to, regardless of anything. But the crowd had flipped on them. And so anyway, we had used what I did is I wrote 6 testimonies and distributed among 6 friends, because we only had, you know how that always works. When you go before a council or a legal, let's say a legislative committee or something like that, you get 2 minutes or whatever, 2, maybe 3. So I wrote up 6 statements, gave them to 6 different people, and they collated together. So we had, in effect, 6 testimonies that could have been given by one person very effectively, I think. And so anyway, we had come armed, if you will, not physically with firearms. Well, maybe some did. But nevertheless, the group delivered a message. And if they didn't get the message that they were slimy communists, they weren't listening. And the crowd got it. Okay? So they took this little break for a cooling off period. And one little tiny guy, he was Vietnamese. When I was in the service, I thought I could identify a Cambodian or a Laos or a Vietnamese from 100 yards. I really did think that, and I thought I could. In fact, I'm pretty sure I could. But I knew this guy was Vietnamese as soon as he came up to me. A little tiny guy, and he spoke in broken English with a Vietnamese accent. And he said, oh, I wished I could testify. And I said, why can't you? He says, because I don't speak good English. And he told me a story. He was a private property owner in the location when the city was going to seize his property. But here's what this property seizure was. You get to keep owning your property. You get to keep paying the taxes. You cannot use it for what you want. You can't even construct anything on it. You can't repair it. You can't upkeep it. It's got to basically crumble until it dissolves. That was basically their position. So they were seizing the property while saying, it's still yours, baby. You still got to pay us your taxes. And I says, tell me your background. Did you come here on a boat? Yeah. Did you come in 1975? Yeah. Did you come from Vietnam? Yeah. Why? They were taking my country, and I could not use my property the way I wanted. I said, you've got to testify. I mean, it's so much better to hear it from somebody that already had it stolen from them by turkeys in government. They weren't actually physically, gobblers. Okay, never mind. Anyway, but they were demons incarnate, in my opinion. And the Salt Lake City Council was going to do it. I just told you the city we were in was going to do it to them. And this little Vietnamese guy got up after the break, and he pled with them to not take his property, and they did anyway. They passed their resolution. So they were communists in very deed, that this little guy had fled his country at the risk of his life in a leaky boat to try and get to freedom. He thought America was going to give him that, and here he was in the cradle of the Rocky Mountains having it stolen from him. What a dastardly deed. I could have used other words too. So, if you take control of property, it is an act of taking. So here's what the American Founders Mentors said. And I was going to bring books, and I was going to show you, and I was like, I used to travel and I'd do these things. I'd bring a trunk. These big trunks, steamer trunks that you took when you were wealthy in the 1920s to go to Egypt. Yeah, that's what I used to bring to these meetings. I'd pull out Blackstone's 4-volume whatever, or here's The Spirit of Laws by Montesquieu. But I don't do that anymore. I usually try and take germane quotations. It's a lot easier on my back than carrying that thing. So here's the mentors of the American Founding Fathers. One of the principal mentors of the American Founding Fathers was John Locke. I'm going to read his statements because the American Founding Fathers voraciously consumed his words. In fact, Locke, Blackstone, and Montesquieu were the principal mortal authors, but the scriptures overrode everything else when they were giving their foundational principles. So Locke was one of them. And this is out of his second essay on civil government. Though the earth and all inferior creatures be common as the gift from God to all men, yet every man has property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may see, are properly his. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state of nature. So if you go out and you collect acorns, they're your property. You can eat them if you want. You can make them into some decoration. I don't care what you do with them. You collected them by your work and you took it out of nature, and that becomes your property, okay? Whatsoever then he removes out of the state of nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with it and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. This is a fundamental nature-linked kind of thing that's in the natural law. So if you take something by your labor, you've added to it to the point that it is rightfully yours, it's your property. He went on to say, the supreme power, meaning your government, cannot take from any man any part of his property without his own consent. For the preservation of property being the end of government. See, government's there to preserve your property, okay? And that for which men enter into society, it necessarily supposes and requires that the people should have property, without which they must be supposed to lose that property by entering into society, which was the end for which they entered into it. He's saying you come into society so you can protect what's yours. That's a fundamental principle. You can band together so that, El Guapo or the banditos in the canyons can't steal it from you, okay? That's why you come into a government society. Nobody can transfer to another more power than he has in himself. And nobody has an absolute arbitrary power over himself or over another to destroy his own life or to take away the life or property of another. This is fundamental stuff the American Founding Fathers cut their teeth on. They studied it from the time of their youth in school. Let's go on to Blackstone. I really was tempted to bring Blackstone's commentaries on the law, Volume 1 anyway, because I'm going to quote quite a bit from these, but you need to understand, again, it was published in 1765 through 1769 as 4 volumes. The rights of free men basically are elucidated in these 4 volumes. And he covers so many things, including abortion, by the way. I wish there were time to talk about how they knew unborn children were human beings, living human beings before the law in their day, and how heinous and egregious it was to take that child's life, and how those people that were unborn have the right and standing before law in the eyes of the judges of the day. They can't seem to get that right nowadays. But anyway, that's not the purpose of this discussion. It's something else at another time, perhaps we may discover. Okay, so here's what Blackstone wrote. And these may be reduced about the basic rights of free men. Because what were the men of England? They were free men. They considered themselves that. What were the American founding fathers? They were subjects to the king, free men in England, under English citizenship. So that's why all this comes across the ages. And by the way, you can read some of Blackstone's verbiage in some of our founding documents the founders put together, like the Declaration of Independence. This stuff is, they wove it into their lives and into their documents. So, about these basic rights of free men. And these may be reduced to 3 principal of primary articles: the right of personal security, the right of personal liberty, and the right of private property. It's always there. If you read the 134th section of the Doctrine and Covenants again, you would be shocked at how closely that correlates to what the founding principles of this nation were. Okay, because as there is no other known method of compulsion or of abridging man's natural free will, but by infringement or diminution of these or other of these important rights, the preservation of these inviolate may justly be said to include the preservation of our civil immunities in their largest and most extensive sense. So what he's saying is, if you have this thing of private property, personal liberty, and your conscience, security, that's the basis of our liberty. Okay, going on, he said, the third absolute right inherent in every Englishman is that of property, which consists in the free use, enjoyment, and disposal of all his acquisitions without any control or diminution, save only by the laws of the land. Now, we're going to see how that applies in just a moment. The original of private property is probably founded in nature. Whoa, that's just what that guy Locke said, isn't it? Okay. He went on to say, so great, moreover, is the regard of law for private property that it will not authorize the least violation of it, no, not even for the general good of the whole community. So if you say we have a whole population of people that have a really different view of intimacy, it doesn't matter. You can't take other people's God-given rights and say we're going to take those and give them to somebody else, even though it's a big group. Doesn't matter how big or little it is. You can't take it for the general good of the whole community. Going on, he says, when an individual's property is taken, it is only by giving him a full indemnification and equivalent for the injury thereby sustained. So this is, you got to pay market value for it. and we don't believe that too much anymore, sadly. In fact, here in the Utah law, we've pretty well written that out in so many ways. Okay, so essence of ownership is control. When we lose control, we lose our ownership. Controlling property is an act of taking. See, if some power comes to office, like in the Salt Lake Valley or in maybe Berlin, and they say we're taking property for our use and purposes, it's the same. It doesn't matter. Okay, so let's just look at the words for a few minutes of American founders. John Adams. These things are so good, and I know I'm going to run out of time because there's so much precious stuff here. All men are born free and independent, and of certain natural, essential, and inalienable rights, among which may be reckoned the right of enjoying and defending their lives and liberties, that of acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, and find that of seeking and obtaining their safety and happiness. Okay, that guy helped write the Declaration. He was the first vice president and second president, okay? Pretty cool guy. Kind of prickly in his personal effects. Not like Thomas Jefferson, a smooth and genteel. Adams was kind of abrupt and clipped in his way of, but he still, he stood with the truth. He went on to say, the moment the idea is submitted into society that property is not as sacred as the laws of God, and that there is not a force of law and public justice to protect it, anarchy and tyranny commence. Property must be secured, or liberty cannot exist. And we're going to see towards the end of this that Karl Marx said their intent was to get rid of private property, and that would take our liberty. Okay? But these guys in the beginning understood this. Our guys that currently govern don't seem to, apparently. Here's what Hamilton said. In the general course of human nature, a power over a man's subsistence amounts to a power over his will. So if you can say, here's how you can't use your land to farm corn, you got to put beets in. You can't raise chickens if you don't, Here, you got mechanics tools, but you can't use them for these purposes. Whatever you say, however you're going to make your living, if the government has control over that, you're going to have control over his will. He said at another time in another Federalist paper, in the main it will be found that a power over man's support is a power over his will. So you must have the means of producing a living for your family. St. George Tucker, I always introduce him, and you guys have been here a number of times, as probably the preeminent scholar of the founding era in regards to constitutional law. He said, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property, and these are the objects of all rights, without due process of law. His private property shall not be taken for the public use without just compensation, as Blackstone said. He had read that stuff. He saw what was in the Constitution and the Declaration and so on. These things are protected. Okay. James Madison, father of the Constitution. He came along pretty soon afterwards, became a president, and he had served immediately when they first had the Congress. He served as a congressman. Okay, so this guy understood the foundational principles discussed in the American Constitution. He said, government is instituted to protect property of every sort. This being the end of government, that alone is not a just government, nor is property secure under it, where the property which a man has in his personal safety and personal liberty is violated by arbitrary seizures of one class of citizens for the service of others, of the rest. You can't take it from the bourgeois and give it to the proletariat. You can't take it from a landowner and give it to a class defined by their activities and intimate behavior. You can't. Not right. Okay. Essence of ownership and control. We lose control, we'll effectively lose ownership. We've said that already. So controlling property is an act of taking. So let's go to the United States Constitution for a few minutes. Constitution, according to the definitions of the founders, paramount, superior, and preeminent to legislative action. That means that legislative actions cannot supersede or override a constitution. You can't say, oh yeah, I know the Constitution says this, but we're going to make a law that says that, contrary to that. You can't legally do that. A lot of times, in fact, almost every time they make a law, they do nowadays. Okay, so in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8, it says this, no title of nobility shall be granted by the United States. Well, this Anti-Discrimination Religious Liberties Bill, Senate Bill 296, didn't create any dukes or princes or barons or whatever. Bradley, what's wrong with you, boy? But it did create special classes with special standing before the law. You don't have to call somebody a duke or a prince or a princess or whatever. Whatever name you want to call them, it's a special status or class. And if you do that, you violate the U.S. Constitution. And also, institutions were given special status and class. Boy Scouts and churches. Okay? So institutions got to be special classes, but you as a business, you as an individual do not have any status to protect your liberty and property and your conscience in these things. And they created them based upon size. Remember I said they did this on a kind of a class warfare thing that's really Marxist? Okay, so large organizations lost their liberties of conscience and religion. if you had a larger organization, you were bound to handle things a certain way. And small organizations would lose their conscience and liberty and religion if they engaged in an agent or broker, like my dad I told you about. And my dad would have never differentiated, I don't think. He would have wanted to say who got to rent his property, but the things that they were trying to protect with this, he would have never thought about that. But if he engaged a professional agent to rent his property, he would have been bound to lose that also. Okay, so big and small lost it based upon how they clashed your ability to pay for it. Okay, so it ignored individual rights of property, conscience, and religious liberties. There was new special protected classes that were created based upon intimate behavior. Okay, so it created responsibilities for other classes. That's you and me. That's bigger businesses. That's people that had, for example, a good friend of mine before he died must have had 40 apartments. And he could rent them to whom he pleased. Not under this law. Okay. These other classes had rights that overrode his to say how he was going to rent his 40 apartments. Okay, another thing, Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1 says, no state shall pass any bill or law impairing the obligation of contracts. See, you and I can write a contract with each other. I'll give you so much gold for so many bicycles, let's just say. If I had gold and if you had bicycles, are two assumptions in this. But let's just say you and I can do contracts, but a state cannot interfere with right of contract, according to Article 1, Section 10. So if a state interferes with the right of contract between an individual who has property and an individual who is going to rent the property, and the state intervenes in that, they're violating Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1. Okay, so the state's saying you must contract with these special new classes which are based upon intimate behavior. And then Amendment 5. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. One guy that was arguing with me about this, oh, these people deserve to be able to live wherever they want. Well, that's maybe true, but other people own these properties. They have to have a say in it, okay? You can't take it without due process for public use without just compensation. There was none of that was offered. Okay, so remember, property can be seized by confiscating ownership or by removing from the owner the ability to control the property. Okay, let's look at the Utah Constitution for a few minutes. Okay, remember again, Constitution is paramount, superior, preeminent to legislative action. You can't set aside any, so the Utah legislature, of all people, should not be able to set aside a Utah constitutional provision with legislative action. Okay? It can't supersede it, can't override it. So there's a lot of references of religious liberty, private property, and rights of conscience in the Utah Constitution. Let's briefly review a few of these. Article 1 is called Declaration of Rights. It doesn't differentiate between individuals, organizations, or institutions. So it doesn't say, oh, we're going to have these rights, but only within certain classes of people. You have them as an individual, you have them as an organization, okay? And if you're an institution, you have them still too, okay? So it doesn't differentiate. So let's look at this one first. Article 1, Section 1. All men have the inherent and inalienable right to enjoy and defend their lives and liberties, to acquire, possess, and protect property, to worship according to the dictates of their conscience. It says we all do. That's Article 1, Section 1, top line of the Utah Constitution. And it goes on to say some of the other things that go along out of the Bill of Rights too. But since we're talking about property and its free exercise and conscience and everything else like that, I just underlined that part. So, it doesn't say just small organizations or just one individual or somebody that's, somehow an institution. No, it just says all have that right. Article 1, Section 4, subtitled Religious Liberty. The rights of conscience shall never be infringed. That means if you, or, the death jab or whatever, the clot shot, whatever you call it, shall never be infringed. The state shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So you can believe your own religious belief system doesn't have to have an institutional stamp on it that says, oh no, we believe in worshiping the Almighty God according to the dictates of our conscience. No, you can do it any way you want. It's okay. And our state can't interfere on that. Okay. Article 1, Section 7, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process. See how this parallels a lot of the United States Constitution? And if they're taking your property by controlling it, and you can keep it and pay taxes on it, whatever you want, it's still depriving you of these things. Article 1, Section 14, searches and seizures, the right of people to be secure in their houses, persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and goes on to say you got to get a warrant to do that. Okay, so these things, right to privacy, all that kind of stuff. Article 1, Section 15. No law shall be passed to abridge or restrain the freedom of speech or of the press. Okay? You can talk about this. You can encourage this. You can support and facilitate this. Section 22 says private property shall not be taken or damaged for public use without just compensation. Okay, so here we're saying, yeah, but this special class of people that we've created, you got to have pity on them. Just, we're going to take it to make sure they get to have a place to live where they want, whatever. The reason I have the little theatrics involved in that is because I had these discussions enough with people to say it doesn't matter. And my dad would have. My dad would have rented to anybody, I think, unless they were going to use it as a meth house or something. I mean, but he had the right to choose. But he wasn't going to discriminate because of some intimate behavior. In fact, I know he didn't, because I know who he rented to, some of the people that he had living there. And I know it was the furthest thing from his mind, but you can't force people to do something against their belief system. It's nice to have a little bit of wet your whistle kind of stuff, okay? Okay, I mean, we're still in the Utah Constitution, Article 1. I mean, this is kind of, they were putting a period and exclamation point upon everything that was in there. This enumeration of rights shall not be construed to impair or deny others retained by the people. So you got more than what they wrote down, okay? And then in Section 27, it says we got to go back to this often, or else we're going to forget. And pretty soon they'll slip through our fingers and they won't be there anymore. This is what it said: frequent recurrence, so going back often, to fundamental principles is essential to the security of individual rights and the perpetuity of free government. We got to be reminded of these things often. We aren't. As a people, we simply are not. Okay, now let's go to some of the words of more recent LDS leaders. Okay, this is a pronouncement in regard to divine institution of marriage that came out 2008, so it's been a few years. What you're going to see is that their public pronouncements on this have sounded like they promote and secure these things. But in action, they didn't in 2015 with this bill. So I'm just going to read you the underlined part because our time is slipping through our fingers. Talking about so long as they do not, these are laws or things that are imposed upon the people, so long as they do not infringe on the integrity of the family or the constitutional rights of church and their adherents. So that's individuals, to administer and practice their religion free of government interference. Government can't mess with this. Okay, so there's this thing in the LDS Church that about consecration, about people consecrating their personal property for God's purposes. Okay, and it's interesting. Most people don't understand that law of consecration really is based upon choice, freedom of choice for anybody that's in it or wants to be in it, and how they're going to administer it, because they can choose what to do with their private property. They never lose that. It is not communism. It's something that they enter into and practice of their own free will. It's called Law of Consecration or United Order. Okay, there's a lot of references we could give on this, but we're going to run out of time whether I read them or not. This is a guy named Marion G. Romney. He made these statements back in 1966. This procedure established the United Order preserved in every man, it preserved for everybody the right to private ownership and management of his property. At his own option, he could alienate it, just get rid of it, or keep and operate it and pass it on to his heirs. It didn't go into some amorphous nirvana scheme that somebody was going to manage it for you. It was still yours, okay? The intent was, however, for him to so operate his property as to produce a living for himself and his dependents. So long as he remained in the order, he consecrated to the church the surplus he produced above the needs and wants of his family. Who defined the needs and wants? The individual. Okay, you might have a whole bunch of needs and wants, and you don't give a hang about any of them, and you'll give everything. Okay, just pick you guys out of the crowd. The point of the matter is that you decided. So if you had a fundamental stewardship, a farm to run, and you had a very successful year, you could give all of the excess, or you could keep all, it didn't matter, it was yours. You chose, okay? Above the wants of his family. This surplus went to a storehouse from which stewardships were given to others and from which the needs of the poor were supplied. This is how the poor were to be taken care of. God-given agency was preserved in the United Order. Thus, in both implementation and ownership and management of the property, the United Order preserves to men their God-given agency, while socialism deprives them of it. What we have in America today is a form of socialism that takes, and it does not have the authority to do so constitutionally. Here's what a guy named, at the time, was Elder Dallin H. Oaks. He's the first counselor in the first presidency now. He's the next in line to become the lead guy. And he has about 5 positions of power from which he speaks. He's a leader in the church. He was a judge. He was a president of a university. He was a lawyer. And he taught law also. He said, concepts of liberty depend upon large-scale obedience to the unenforceable, and this prerequisite depends upon religions that teach fundamentals such as the equality of people and the importance of respecting others' property and of personal honesty and integrity. So this idea of importance of respecting others' property was taken away by this Senate bill that we're talking about, because now this special class of people gets to impose their will upon the owner, okay? But Oakes talked about this. He counseled us to contend for the free exercise of religion. This is more difficult because it requires cooperative action by believers of various faiths. Where government-guaranteed free exercise of religion exists, we should press government officials to honor these guarantees. Did they? No. That's how this Senate bill passed. They chose to ignore that for the individuals that were going to have imposed upon them these new status of special classes. Going on, he advised, we should be alert to oppose government officials and public policy advocates who suggest that the free exercise of religion is limited to freedom of worship. Absolutely and unequivocally. But does this happen under this law? No, it does not. There is no stamp of approval on how you rent your apartments, and you can retain that right. He went on to say, free exercise surely protects religious citizens in acting upon their beliefs in public policy debates and in votes cast as citizens or lawmakers. Well, I went and opposed this before the legislature and got squashed by their opposing views in the committee meetings. It's very interesting. This is a little longer statement. I take it because it covered a lot of territory, and not necessarily that others couldn't have been used, but this was a continuous statement by one guy. Quoting, we must not forget that moral agency is an essential part of God's plan for all his children. By the way, moral agency is weasel words, in my opinion. Our own freedom of choice goes far beyond deciding whether you're going to use some substance prohibited by church doctrine. This moral agency thing has to do with liberty at all levels, including government, and how we live our lives and where we live our lives and what we do with our lives. And we have that choice. It's a God-given gift. Okay? We must not forget that moral agency is an essential part of God's plan for all his children. I would say agency, much more broadly defined than what he says here. That eternal plan presented to us in the premortal council in heaven included the gift of agency. He goes on to quote, all this in the next few slides is Hales. In that grand council, Lucifer, known as Satan, used his agency to oppose God's plan. God said, because Satan rebelled against me and sought to destroy the agency of man, which I, the Lord God, had given him, I caused that he should be cast down. Wait. Even before we were born on this earth, it is the LDS doctrine that Satan sought to destroy our agency. If government does it today, that's a big concern. And you could infer that it's satanic even. Okay, so Satan was cast out. He continued, and a third part of the hosts of heaven turned away from me because of their agency. Those people there that rebelled against God could do it according to their own choice. As a result, Heavenly Father's spirit children who chose to reject his plan and follow Lucifer lost their divine destiny. Jesus Christ, using his agency, said, here am I, send me. Thy will be done and the glory be thine forever. Jesus, who exercised his agency to sustain Heavenly Father's plan, was identified and appointed by the Father as our Savior, foreordained to perform the atoning sacrifice for all. Similarly, our exercise of agency to keep the commandments enables us to fully understand who we are and receive all the blessings of our Heavenly Father has, including the opportunity to have a body, to progress, to experience joy, to have a family, and to inherit eternal life. That sounds familiar. Oh, life, liberty, property, pursuit of happiness. Oh, yeah, I think I've heard those before. That's what the whole basis of the American experiment of government was based upon. This, what he describes as a heavenly plan. Going on, he said, there are 4 cornerstones of religious freedom that we as Latter-day Saints must rely upon and protect. First is freedom to believe. It doesn't have to be an institutionalized, cast in concrete, presented to the world belief system. You can believe what you want. No one should be criticized, persecuted, or attacked by individuals or governments either for what he or she believes about God. It is very personal. It's not perjury if you say you're against something because you have a religious belief. It's very personal, very important. An early declaration of our beliefs regarding religious liberty states, and he goes on to quote this quotation in the 134th section that I quoted earlier, no government can exist in peace except such laws are framed and held inviolate as will secure to each individual a free exercise of conscience. The civil magistrate should restrain crime but never control conscience or suppress the freedom of the soul. The 4th cornerstone of religious liberty is the freedom to live our faith, freedom to exercise, free exercise of faith, not just in the home and chapel, but also in public places. The Lord commands us not only to pray privately, but also to go forth and let our light so shine before men that they may see our good works and glorify our Father which is in heaven. By the way, if I had a few more minutes, I'd read you some pretty long quotations out of the 4th and 5th chapters of Acts. Or, yeah, we'll see. I know we got to get done with it at a certain time. I'm trying to keep from looking over at Enoch because he maybe told me to cut it off at some point. But the fact of the matter is, those guys, Peter and John, did not say, oh, by your leave, our leaders. No. They continued to worship Christ and proclaim his name in spite of what the powers that be said to do. And they went down there, and you can read the 4th and 5th chapters of Acts in your own time if you wish. Anyway, so Hales went on to say, some are offended when we bring our religion into the public square. Yet the same people who insist that their viewpoints and actions be tolerated in society are often very slow to give the same tolerance to religious believers who also wish their viewpoints and actions to be tolerated. The general lack of respect for religious viewpoints is quickly developing into social and political intolerance, which I might say the church facilitated in Utah 10 years ago, for religious people and institutions. as we face increased pressure to bow to secular standards, it's this cultural drift, forfeit our religious liberties and compromise our agency, consider what the Book of Mormon teaches about our responsibilities. In the book of Alma, we read Amlici, a very cunning and wicked man, who sought to be king over the people and deprived them of rights and privileges, which was alarming to the people of the church. They were taught by King Mosiah to raise their voices for what they felt was right. Therefore they assembled themselves together throughout all the land, every man according to his mind, whether they were for or against Amlici, in separate bodies, having much dispute one with another. I might point out to you that the righteous cause prevailed, and the kingmen didn't in this particular instance, because the people were willing to stand up and speak about what they considered to be God-given rights. He goes on to say, in these discussions, members of the church and others had the opportunity to come together, experience the spirit of unity, and be influenced by the Holy Ghost. It came to pass that the voice of the people came against Amlici, that he was not made king. Now, a while back, I went up to central Montana on the plains and spoke in a event that was across spectrums, if you will, in the religious community. You know, we had pastors and other belief systems that were speaking and so on. I was a keynote speaker in regard to religious liberty. This was an effort by the people in those communities to band together to prevent their religious liberty from being lost. It was a little microcosm of this debate against Amlici. Okay, going on, just as the last one, but I wanted to get to this one with the date on it. It was given in April of 2015. The state passed Senate Bill 296 in March of 2015 with the complicit assistance of the senior leadership of the LDS Church. He said all of these things, but by golly, they turned their back on him when they passed this bill. Okay, so I mean, I was bringing you from, early 20s through the time that this bill was passed. And a bunch of I did go back to 1966 with Romney. But the fact of the matter is they gave pretty good lip service to this, but their actions betrayed them. As disciples of Jesus Christ, we have a responsibility to work together, like-minded believers, to raise our voices for what is right, while members should never claim or even imply that they're speaking for the church. All right, fine. I just don't want to take the jab. I mean, I keep going back to that. I'm not saying the church has anything to say about this. It's my choice. Okay, they're speaking for the church. We are all invited in our capacity as citizens to share our personal witness with conviction and love, every man and woman according to his or her own mind. Okay, again, came out in 2015 in a publication called The Ensign. Let's go to the Karl Marx Communist Manifesto. Okay, so it's driven by, now here's Marx and Engels. I mean, kind of lovely men, don't you think? I don't know how they kept their beards out of their soup, but that was their problem, not mine, I guess. But this doctrine of class conflict is played on by Marx and Engels as an effort to disrupt society. Okay, so they said the bourgeois is supposedly the oppressors made of the middle class, property owners. Some of you may feel in that category. The proletariat is supposedly the oppressed class. Some of you may feel yourselves in that category. I don't know. But you can draw your own parallels and play this out before us. The rights and properties of the bourgeois are to be subverted on behalf of the so-called oppressed class. Okay, so I'm in the next few quotes, clear statements, are going to be quotations from the Communist Manifesto, talking about their mission is to destroy all previous securities for insurances of individual property. By golly, if you're a communist, you can't have full right of private property. It says, in this sense, the theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence, abolition of private property. These are their words, not mine. One sentence, they're saying communism is getting rid of private property. Remember, seizure can happen by taking control or by actually taking physical possession. Okay, he says, you are horrified at our intending to do away with private property. You reproach us, therefore, with intending to do away with a form of property, the necessary condition for whose existence is the non-existence of any property for the immense majority of society. They're going to take it away from everybody. If you don't have it, fine, you're way ahead of the curve. If you do have it, better be willing to give it up. In one word, you reproach us with intending to do away with your property. Precisely so. That is just what we intend. These guys were very open in their statement about how this is communism. This is the Salt Lake City Council, and this is the Utah legislature as they wheedle it away out of our hands. It's what they're doing, by the way, also, and I hate to take a tangent, but this year and last year and the year before, as they've attempted to take control of our water rights. Our water rights are a right. I purchased mine. I bought them when I bought my property. They want to control my rights there. It's another wheedling away. Okay, in one word, you reproach us with intending to do away with your property. Precisely so, that is just what we intend. The communist revolution is the most radical rupture with traditional property relations. This cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property. It's an open, their sights are on our property. And they have other things that they were seeking to do with marriage and everything else like that. They actually introduced and practiced a community of wives. Nobody could be just with one husband. That was too much like private property. So they were available to all that were members of the party. And we could talk about that at some length too. Okay, these are all steps that Marx said we need to follow in order to destroy government and bring communism to power. So I'm going to just, man, I wish we could take all the time on these 10 points. But you need to see how these 10, say again? Okay. These whole 10-point thing, so much of it has to do with property and the education system and how they were going to run the money system and how they were going to run our transport. The TSA, have you ever heard of them? Okay. I mean, have you ever heard of the Federal Reserve? Have you ever heard of the IRS? Okay. So all of these things, he says, these aren't just, what these 10 points is how they're going to overthrow freedom. And people say to me, how many of those do you think we've adopted? I say 9.5. Oh, where haven't we? I say, well, I don't know. We've adopted all of them in large part, but I'm not sure what part have been really left out. We in the nation have already done that. They have been. The agencies have been weaponized, as is mentioned. And by the way, let's go back for a second. Look at number 2. I always go with shiny objects. You told me to at the beginning of the class. But at any rate, heavy progressive or graduated income tax. That means a stepped income tax based upon your income. This group gives 10%, this group gives 20, this group gives 30, this group gives 50. Let's just take that. That isn't how it's written right now. Whether there's 10 steps in that or 4, which Mike Lee wanted to do was 4. He wants to get rid of some of the steps in it. No, it's still a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. So I don't care whether you call it 10 steps or 4 steps, it's still communist. You know, second point. These things are so widely accepted, and this one, number 10, free education for all children in public schools. This has become the basis of a modern American religion. It is across the entire nation. Hundreds of billions of dollars are spent every year on a tax-supported religious belief system. And they have unseated the religiosity of the Americans based upon the teachings of Freud and Darwin and Marx and Keynes and Kinsey. These high priests of the secular humanist religion are having their belief systems taught by public force in our nation. So these things have unseated religiosity of the next generation. Rarely indeed do we find a child that's religious belief tracks really closely with their parents anymore. Okay, so here's the 10 points. Maybe as Enoch says, we'll do a class sometime. Here's some actual wording from Senate Bill 296. It says, it claims not to create special classes when in fact it does. So I have here, I'm not going to go through all the lines because as you can see, this was a very long bill. But those lines that are noted there, as you could say, it'd take us half an hour to read those, and you're going to see the next slide and gag. Okay, the Act creates special protected classes for housing and employment based upon sexual orientation and gender identity. Okay, so it says it doesn't create special classes. When it does, there's 51 lines. Sexual orientation and gender identity are identified as protected classes. It says it specifically on these lines noted within the bill. So as you can see at the very long, it exceeds 1,000 lines. This is not something you take to bed with you and read in a few minutes. You'll be asleep before you get through it. Anyway, so it says that it doesn't create special classes. When it does, on 43 lines, religious institutions of Boy Scouts of America are identified as protected classes. And I give you some examples there. So everybody but religious institutions and Boy Scouts were thrown under the bus. No one else retains their right of conscience or religious liberties. Okay? Says, well, we're protecting opposing viewpoints in the workplace, when it doesn't. Here's the lines that are cited by the bill's advocates as proof for protection of the individuals in expressing their opposing views without fear of retribution. So there's a few lines here that come out of there, and they go on to the next slide too. But I've underlined specific parts. You can express your opinion, and in line 698, unless the expression is in direct conflict with the essential business-related interests of the employer. Well, if you're a business and you want to look woke, you always have your special interests embedded in that, okay? So you don't have a right to do that. Let's go on to the next page. Unless the expression of expressed activity is in direct conflict with the essential business-related interests of the employer. What they're saying is the employer sets the standard and you can't oppose that. That sounds like religious liberty to me. Okay, so your individual rights are protected if you're not opposed to the organization's interests, quote unquote. Now, reading those lines I just went through, around that time there was a police officer who got crosswise with the Salt Lake Police Department, including the management of the city, the elected officials. He expressed his position that he did not want to ride his motorcycle in a gay pride event due to religious convictions. Perform other duties, but not that. Okay? Well, in order to justify their ultimate retaliation against any officer who takes a similar position in the future, all the city, the management, or the departments must do is, according to the Senate Bill 296, express their desire to uphold the spirit of this law in compliance with the effort to not discriminate due to sexual orientation and gender identity, and the effort to appear that they operate in fairness to the general population of these matters. They do not want the city or department to appear as they have a desire to loosely apply the non-discrimination perspective of the overall act. So, how long did it take to say that this individual was in conflict with the city's and department's business-related interests? Doesn't take much to leap from that to this and suddenly, sorry guy, you don't have a job anymore, okay? So you're going to be doomed if you happen to take that sort of position. Okay, so that logic could be applied by any business or organization when confronted by the militant attitude that is associated with this matter. Any organization with more than 15 employees has got to comply to the position. Okay, so that's a lot of medium-sized and bigger organizations. Almost every store, for example, would have to qualify into that. And you read that if they work in 20 calendar weeks. Oh yeah, we're going to only work for 19 weeks. We don't have to do this. That ain't going to happen unless you're some spook alley thing or something. Anyway, any property owner with more than 4 housing units is required to apply. And there's the lines that you got to see, and we'll see that in a minute. And any small owner with less than 4 has to comply if they enlist a real estate broker or broker to assist them with their property. And these are the places you can read this, okay? So you need to understand that what they did is they narrowly defined anybody that retained their rights, unless you were a church or the Boy Scouts. Okay, now I must point out that the church was strongly aligned with the Boy Scouts in those days, and they wanted to protect the Boy Scouts' behinds. I would have said it stronger. What they found ultimately and finally was the Boy Scouts were so woke, they went off the cliff. Anyway. All right. So we're going to have to call this quits in a minute. Tell me when I got to quit. 10, did you say? Oh, it depends. Oh, close to 50 slides, but I can run through them quickly. You see, I said I usually do the religious liberties in 6 presentations of an hour and a half each, because this is fundamental to our retaining any of our liberties. And we have largely lost this in the state of Utah, and the principal religion of this state have collaborated to facilitate the demise of our truly personal individual religious liberties. So let's go to A Man for All Seasons. Okay, that's a play that's by Robert Bolt. It first came out in July of 1960. Went on Broadway for a year, became an Academy Award-winning show in '66. I remember these days, okay? So I'm sorry. That's why things like this come to my mind, okay? And this was a closely observed, shall we say, thought-provoking movie, okay? Most people don't even have a clue about it today. It also became a television movie for some of you that are younger. But it's based on a true story of Thomas More. He was a 16th century Chancellor of England. He didn't go along with King Henry VIII's wish to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, so he could marry Anne Boleyn, the sister of his former mistress. Now this, you can't make this stuff up. I know they do in soap operas, but to tell you the truth, King Henry was a profligate offender of many things. So Thomas More was a principled man. He was envied by rivals like Cromwell, and he was loved by the common people in his family. Now this scene comes from Act 1, Scene 7. Thomas More rebukes William Roper for wanting to cut down the laws to get to the devil. Now see, what we're going to see is that we're cutting down laws right now that violate Utah Constitution, United States Constitution, fundamental belief systems of the American Founding Fathers, that we're just going through with a swather. We're chopping those babies down. We're opening the path because we have a belief that we're doing some good by doing that. Now, we could go back and we could review what George Washington said about how that oftentimes leads to the destruction of things because it sounds like a good idea at the time. So we want to see if coming through and swathing out that big area of these fundamental guards, like think of them as windbreaks, if you're going to prevent the tornado or the hurricane or whatever from coming in and knocking down your house or blowing the roof off or whatever. Here's what Moore said in a minute. What will happen to our families, our individual rights, or even our churches? Every church, ultimately, will be at risk if we cut down everything that's giving their protections right now, such as constitutional protections. Okay, so here's the dialogue in Act 1, Scene 7. Roper says, so, now you give the devil the benefit of law. And Moore says, yes. What would you do? Cut a great road through the law to get after the devil? Roper says, yes, I'd cut down every law in England to do that. Moore says, oh, and when the last law was down and the devil turned around on you, where would you hide, Roper? The laws all being flat. Okay? So we're cutting great swaths, not just this Senate Bill 296 that's 10 years old now, of principles designed to keep us safe and our posterity the blessings of liberty. And our posterity will ultimately be shackled with onerous encroachments of this act, and subsequent acts will assuredly follow its philosophical origins. So, what do? Abandon baseline principles and hope for the best? We're foolish to think if this has brought peace in our time. If you think, oh, these guys that wanted this so badly, everybody's going to be okay. They're going to be our friends now. There's not going to be any pushback, blowback, any other demands, anything like that. How many, you don't remember, you weren't there. Neither was I, honestly. I'm not that old. But in 1938, British Prime Minister Chamberlain, he put a deal together with Hitler about Czechoslovakia. Maybe you remember the story, I don't know. But the fact of the matter is, he said, I've won peace in our time. I gave Hitler Czechoslovakia. It wasn't his to give. It wasn't the Utah legislature's prerogative to give away anything of our property. And Chamberlain came back to England waving that piece of paper. Go back and look at some of the old newsreels about it. I have one piece in our time. We gave Hitler Czechoslovakia. Well, wait. What do the Czechoslovakian people say about this? I mean, you'll think about this for a minute or two. Did it end up happily ever after? Or did Hitler say, I'm going to gobble up more? And that's exactly where we are on this. Religious institutions, not just the LDS Church, but others also, and the Boy Scouts can say, we've got a safe haven. But they didn't just let the camel's nose in the tent. The whole camel and a whole herd of the camels is following close behind. And what you're going to see is a militant, shall we say, assault on these other things because of this little encroachment that some people think is small, but I think it's pretty big. Okay, so they're not going to be satisfied until they complete the agenda. It's more highly organized, cleverly disguised, powerfully promoted, and I would say abundantly funded than most will admit. So what are we going to do? Once we've cut down these charters of liberty, our Constitution, our Utah Constitution, our scriptures, the tradition, historical precedent, and so on, what's going to happen? Again, going back and quoting two LDS leaders, over time, this Ezra Taft Benson, the guy on top, is quoting the guy on the bottom, J. Reuben Clark Jr. And I've got a couple of slides on this thing. So they both said this at different times in different talks. Quoting, so one constitutional right after another yielded without any real contest, our backs getting nearer to the wall with each retreat. It is now proposed we retreat still further. Is not this suicide? Is there anyone so naive as to think that things will right themselves without a fight? There has been no more fight in us than there is in a bunch of sheep, and we have been much like sheep. Freedom was never brought to the people on a silver platter or maintained with whisk brooms and lavender sprays. And I do not think that all of these usurpations, intimidations, impositions are being done to us through inadvertence or mistake. The whole course is deliberately planned and carried out. Its purpose is to destroy the Constitution and our constitutional government, then to bring chaos out of which the new statism with its slavery is to arise with its cruel, relentless, selfish, ambitious crew in the saddle, riding hard with whip and spur, a red-shrouded band of night riders for despotism. By the way, it continues, but I wanted to point this out. Okay, the communist movement is a conflict-based movement. What it does is it creates a push between opposite sides. They choose to pit labor against management, women against men, race against race, religion against religion. They don't care. It's to disrupt society. And what this is in this particular bill is they're conflicting our private property and our religious against another group that claims to be oppressed. Okay? Going on with the quotation. You can read this after if you want, write it down. If we do not vigorously fight for our liberties, we shall go clear through to the end of the road and become another Russia or worse. Okay, so those are the conferences they did. Here's another continuation of another report. I say unto you with all the soberness I can that we stand in danger of losing our liberties, and that once lost, only blood will bring them back, and once lost, we of this church will. Now see, I can't see why they're selling out the individual component of this. They think they're protecting the institution, but by throwing the individual under the bus, the institution will ultimately fail or have great difficulties. And once lost, we of this church will, in order to keep the church moving forward, going forward, have more sacrifices to make and more persecutions to endure than we have yet known. Heavy as our sacrifices and grievous as our persecutions of the past have begun. Okay, the ride's going to get bumpy, kids. I got a few closing thoughts. Do we have a few minutes, Enoch? Boy, he's not a hard master. I told you what George Washington said. There's but one straight course, and that is to seek truth and pursue it steadily. That is a placard that's in front of my eyes all the time when I'm on my desk. I seek truth, and come what may, I hope we can obtain it ultimately and finally. Remember Jefferson said, I'm a sect of myself as far as I know? And I don't believe he was, because his belief system is very common with what many of us believe. Okay, rights are created or granted in this legislation. And there's some of the lines I talk about. Speak of a right granted or protected under this chapter. A responsibility is created for others, in this case, employers and property owners, to fulfill the newly created rights. Those are not rights as instituted by God and as recognized in the Declaration of Independence and others of the Founding Fathers' writings. They have created or granted new rights to specific institutions or parties. If they have to be fulfilled by others, like you out of your hide as a property owner, it is not a God-given right, okay? Neither the Constitution of the United States or the Utah Constitution ever differentiate between individual or organizational, regardless of size or institution, regards to rights of conscience or religion. They go down to the individual. You don't have to have the stamp of approval of an institution before you can believe something. Some of you may believe that you can't believe anything that your religious institution doesn't endorse. You're going to find out that you have a lot broader scope of belief than that. Because, quite frankly, the correlated subject matter is not broad enough to cover all things. It's kind of like, shall we say, why the founders resisted a Bill of Rights. They could never enumerate all your rights. Yeah, what if we forgot one? No, they're all there, no matter, regardless. You have rights that are undefined. You retain all, and that's what the Ninth Amendment says. So, you as an individual have greater latitude than what some institutions and organizations would say you do. It'd be a grave error to begin to limit those things and come under the ruse of government sanction. Okay, China does that right now. Your right to worship. Oh, you can have your right to worship in China as long as we approve it. Now, don't think about that too long, people, because institutions that go there have to be approved by the official sanction of the government. Okay, so we got to be, as individuals, recognize the retaining our God-given rights individually, as the Declaration says. It doesn't take a government action to create a right of conscience or religion. There's no organizational structure or critical mass, so many members required. You don't. A church that gets organized with 6 members has its religious liberty just like an organization that has 17 or 18 million or a billion. And so this could apply to the Catholics as well. Okay, the purpose of government is to secure individual God-given rights. Property can be seized by confiscation of ownership or by removing from the owner the right to control the property. Taking control of the property is an act of taking. Now, here's my next little few, and it's going to be done in mere moments, okay? You can sit back and relax, and then you can leave, okay? There was a guy named Frederick Bastiat, little French guy, absolutely adored the American Founding Fathers. It's not far away from correct to say he worshiped the American Founding Fathers. He loved them. He lived, and well, he died in 1850. Little French guy. The French originally had some pretty cool guys, like Lafayette, for example, and the Scarlet Pimpernel. No, just kidding. Some of you may have seen that movie with your kids or grandkids. Anyway, Bastiat said he had grief on 2 things with the American founders. One was they had not resolved the issue of slavery, which was an abomination, even in his 1850 when he died. He said they screwed up royally when they didn't fix this idea of slavery. Second thing was the idea of abomination of tariffs, which he said America was using them wrong. And we're having a lot of discussion nowadays about tariffs, and probably really worthy of our discussion again in the future. But everything else, he pretty much felt like the American Founding Fathers got the formula right. And ultimately and finally, we hopefully will get this slavery thing. We can avoid violating the 13th Amendment with an instituted draft, which is compulsory, slavery, basically. That's another discussion. And get through this tariff thing that we're discussing nowadays. So anyway, I'm just going to read a few statements, very brief statements. You need to go home and read a little book. This was another one I almost brought tonight, but didn't, because I'm trying to break the habit of bringing a trunk load of books when I come to talk to people. It's a little book called The Law. He was an economic genius, and you ought to read his books too about that. But The Law is a little book. If you have it at home tonight, you can read it before you went to sleep. If you love liberty, you are going to love this book. Okay. So here's what he said about private property and the law. Bastiat said, in regards to the natural right of private property and the definition of legalized plunder, which is government takings, if you will, because they made it legal. Now, see, a bandito, or whatever you want to call them, a secret combination, that's largely a government nowadays. If you take them and allow them to take from individuals, that is a takings, that is illegal. But if the law says you can do it, Bastiat's position was it's legalized plunder. And he says, you know, when they come in under legalized plunder and take your property, he was French, remember, he says the gendarmes are on their side. The French police were on their side. And so if you're resisting and the SWAT team comes, they're going to take you out. But if they've made it legal to be plundered by government action, it's to be despised. Okay, let's read this quotation. Each of us has a natural right from God to defend his person, his liberty, and his property. These are the three basic requirements of life, and the preservation of any one of them is completely dependent on the preservation of the other two. So here's what he's saying. You can't defend your person and your liberty if your property's taken. Okay? See, the communists want to take your property right up front. They admit that. Okay? The government of Utah, the government of the state, as well as the city government in Salt Lake, want to be able to take your property too. They're going to let you continue to pay taxes and all that kind of good stuff. No, it's yours ostensibly, but they're going to dictate how it's controlled. Whether it's to whom you rent it, or whether or not you can facilitate and build on it and keep it maintained, etc., etc. Okay. These are the three basic requirements of life, and the preservation of anyone is completely dependent on the preservation of the other two. For what are our faculties but the extension of our individuality? And what is property but an extension of our faculties? Okay, going on. When a portion of wealth is transferred from a person who owns it without his consent and without compensation, and whether by force or by fraud, to anyone who does not own it, then I say that property is violated. You've got to rent to these people, guys. Oh, but you churches and you Boy Scouts don't have to, but you do. Who does not own it, then I say the property is violated, that an act of plunder is committed. He defined it very clearly, but we, with our state government, our national government, very often are saying, no. No, that's, you know, you're just overstating. You're being a scaredy cat, you're being a kind of a fearmonger, whatever, but it was clearly understood 200 years ago. Okay. He went on to say, how is the legal plunder to be identified? Oh, this is something we ought to listen to. Quite simply, see if the law takes from some persons what belongs to them and gives it to other persons to whom it does not belong. See if the law benefits one citizen at the expense of another by doing what the citizen himself cannot do without committing a crime. See, you can't take his property and you use it for what you want without being arrested. Okay? Sorry, guy. No, I'm not sorry. Okay? You can't do this without committing a crime as an individual. When a portion of wealth is transferred from the person who owns it without consent, without compensation, and whether by force or fraud, to anyone who does not own it, then I say that property is violated, that an act of plunder is committed. When the law itself commits its act, that it is supposed to suppress, I say that plunder is still committed. And I add that from the point of view of society and welfare, this aggression against rights is even worse. Think about this for just a second. If it were always illegal for you to take her property or whatever, okay, yeah, I can understand that, see it. But if they make it the law, that you can take her property through the government's largesse, if you will, then we have a bigger problem, because it's still plunder. But because it's legal, now you think you have a right to it. It's a pretty serious offense. What's this, thou shalt not steal, 8th commandment? I think I've read that before, out of Exodus 20. Okay. Bastiat on socialism says, socialists look upon people as raw material. You're raw material, don't you know it? What's wrong with you? To be formed into social combinations, but it is, wait a minute, this is what DEI does. These social clubs and the military and everything else they're doing, they are forming new social alliances. Government has taken it upon itself to say, you must associate with these people. Okay. But it is upon the law that socialism itself relies. Socialists desire to practice legal plunder, not illegal plunder. They're going to make it illegal. They make it according to the law. Socialists, like all other monopolists, desire to make the law their own weapon. And when once the law is on the side of socialism, how can it be used against socialism? For then plunder is abetted by the law. It does not fear your courts, your gendarmes, and your prisons. Because the courts are going to uphold it's legal. We took it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says, yeah, you're upholding the law. You're okay. No. Rather, it may call upon them for help. So they get the courts and the gendarmes, if you will, and their prisons to enforce what has now become legal in their system. But how is this legal plunder to be identified? This is the last slide, you guys. It's okay. How is this legal plunder to be identified? Quite simply, see if the law takes from some persons what belongs to them and gives it to other persons to whom it does not belong. See if the law benefits one citizen at the expense of another by doing what the citizen himself cannot do without committing a crime. And I would submit to you that Senate Bill 296, as well as countless other bills that we pass without a second thought, Utah is attempting to seize the rights of people with water, which is protected, by the way, in the Constitution, and turn that over to the governor to adjudicate and control under a commission, of course. We're going to make sure a committee helps it happen. That spreads the blame. We're going to make sure that you have a responsibility to get jabbed, or that you have to shut down your business or whatever in violation of Article 1, Section 10, where you have contracts with your employees or whatever. See how a state has overstepped its bounds. And by the way, in the spring of 2020, the Utah legislature gave a free pass, get out of jail law to everybody that responded to the COVID con the way the institution wanted. So,
Explain that.
the governor makes a decree. The legislature said he can't be held responsible. One of the public health official decides this or that or the other about masking or about spacing or about shutdowns, education, businesses, blah, blah, blah. That individual cannot be held accountable by state law.
Could it be overcome?
Of course it could, but the fact of the matter, these turkeys gave away that which was not theirs to give away. And the fact of the matter is that it's even broader than that. The impositions that were created and imposed upon me and countless others, I was supposed to die. Okay, we don't need to get into that detail. My family was told daily, unplug. He's toast, he's gone. But they never gave up on me. They were stubborn as I am. Okay, but the medical procedures could not be held accountable. Even though everybody, virtually, if they had two brain cells to rub together, knew that remdesivir and all these other associated modalities would kill. Intubation on somebody of my age almost had a 100% death rate across the nation, 100%. And they still did it as the modality of treatment. They can't be held responsible. Everybody is given a get out of jail letter, and that's what the legislature did in spring of 2020. And it was wrong, just like it was wrong them seizing property and beliefs and these pride of conscience and everything else, they seized it. And religious leaders said, if you believe otherwise, it's perjury, because you cannot have a religious belief that's contrary to what our institutional statement is. That is a vile statement. We're going to have more of those things in the not too distant future, because the guy that said those things is probably going to outlive the guy that's currently in the job. Sorry. Anyway, so that's where we are. These things are, you can't just brush over them and say, oh, they're not that important, because little by little, as was said in that exchange between Roper and the man for all seasons, we're going to cut down all our laws until there's nothing to protect us. And this is where we are in America today. And this law of 10 years ago is in full force and effect today, along with all these other ones we've been talking about. So with that, was I supposed to end at 8:30 roughly? Yeah, see, I did pretty good in spite of everything. So I'll turn the time back over to you, Enoch, and you can come in and close the meeting, and we'll pack up and get everybody home before the roads get too slick.
12 more hours.
12 more hours. I know that's right. We could finish at 8:30 in the morning.
Really appreciate you, Scott, coming down, and there's a lot to think about. So much you said kept making my brain go on tangents and other things that would be important to talk about. But you touched on water rights, property rights, these fundamental freedoms. This cannot be emphasized enough right now. How much they want to destroy our water rights, all of our property rights, because it's communism, right? Abolition of private property, but they are so focused on water rights right now. I have a presentation. I'm not going to give a short presentation, but I'm going to tease you. So you go subscribe to my Rumble and YouTube, and I'm going to tell you what I need to talk about. So, but briefly speaking, what they are doing right now, it's like, you know, Gulliver, the old Gulliver's Travels story. This is this old story about this giant who like falls asleep in a shipwreck. Do I have it right? This is like before my time, but yeah. And he falls asleep, and as he's asleep, he's this giant, and these little people come and they tie something around his arm, tie something around his leg, and he wakes up and he has 1,000 ropes around him. Okay, this bill he just talked about 10 years ago is one rope. And they're adding little ropes by little ropes, right? One at a time. Our goal as patriots, those that love the law, is to incrementally move in our direction, right? We can't be disappointed because we don't have big victories, or because we can't walk into the governor's office and say, you're doing the wrong thing, and oh my gosh, look, I restored freedom. Can't wait till my kids hear about this, right? It's not like that, right? It's like that in the movies when we watch Marvel, right? How many times did you wish you kind of had Captain America's power when you were seeing any variety of things in politics, right? Yeah, right? But it's not how it works in the real world. They incrementally bind us. We have to incrementally unwind. And so that's why liberty is a lifelong pursuit. So what they are incrementally doing now, okay, so I preface with that so that what I'm going to tell you about what the legislature is doing is not about being alarmist, but it is very serious, and it is indicative of what is coming if we don't pay attention, if we don't gather, if we don't learn how to organize a little better, which is why I wrote about that. If we don't learn the right way to organize, and then when we do organize, if we're not founded on correct principles. So, as they are taking our water rights incrementally, I saw this bill come through the legislature. Blows my mind. I can't even believe what they're trying to do. I'm going to tell you in a second, but so I'm like building up to it. In 2020, they did something really bad, and what they're doing now is way worse. So in 2020, they tried to pass a bill that said for 2 weeks during an emergency, a city has control, they said this, of your body and your property. They said you are the property of the city during an emergency, and they can treat your body the way they want to. That was in the law. What kind of nonsense? These guys are insane that they could write that, pen it out. We put out a call to action at like midnight, and then by 8 a.m., the bill was killed because it was so egregious and it caught everyone off guard, and they probably thought they were just going to pass it and let it through. So that was 2020. Then come 2024, I was looking at legislation, and I found in a bill, those words in that 4-year period had found their way into the law anyway, elsewhere. I think instead of a city, maybe it was a county, or like they'd done something slightly different, right? But they are going to keep putting those little things incrementally. You'll never be able to right, stop tyrants from being tyrants, right? They're the scorpion, and we're crossing the river, and they're going to be who they are. So what's worse than that? What's worse than them putting in the law that we control your body, we control your property?
Us ignoring it.
Well, so to my shock, they're passing this. They tried. Okay, so the bill actually is dying, but there could be 100 other bills where they're doing the same thing. I don't know, right? This particular bill that I read through, it's currently stalled, but they were giving the National Guard authority to use lethal force to protect environmental areas in the same bill that they said we can take water rights without telling the public. Now you put those two together, right? So that doesn't mean, okay, there's gonna be some big problem tomorrow, right? But these are ropes that they are winding more and more. And if we're not watching and paying attention. Now, the suggestion that we have in our strategy is you can't just go and beg your representative to do the right thing. That can be 5% of a strategy if you have 1,000 people, and some people can work, with on bills. But fundamentally, you have to start at the local level. You have to start with your basic rights. Farmers have to know how to organize with other farmers. You have to know how to go to your city and tell your city to nullify when the state does that. Okay? It's a lot easier to pass small kind of city ordinances or resolutions and so forth. But overall, there has to be a culture that knows that's wrong and knows why it's wrong. Right? So I'm going to do a presentation on this exact subject. I'm going to go home and I'm going to get it done tonight. I'm going to record it, and you guys can see that. But it was pretty egregious. It was also interesting that they were connecting the actions of the National Guard with what they called a federal commission, and there's all these federal agencies that were going to come and protect Utah's water rights, and protect them meaning control them, right? Control them. And so that being said, that's why these classes are important. That's why the people cannot forget how government works. And, they can pass 1,000 bad laws, but if the people know their rights, the laws become void, because there's a natural law that says the people have to believe in the laws that they are governed under. And that's why culture precedes law. They work on the culture first. And when the culture generally believes something enough, they push it. And that's exactly why they're pushing this cultural narrative of, did you know the state owns all the water in Utah? Go complain to your state representative about what they're doing with water, and I bet you half of them will tell you, well, the state owns all the water. Didn't you know that? There's like a whisper campaign, they call it, going on.
But the Constitution specifically states it does not.
Right, correct. Which, something I'll put in my presentation. I'm going to show you the law and the Constitution, kind of how they're skirting around that. But it's interesting how you know what side they're on when they partake in a whisper campaign like that. Because if your constituents are like, well, that guy's smart, he knows what he's talking about, I'm not a lawyer, I guess the state owns all the water. Then when the city comes down and says, you have to give us your water, they just go, I guess the state owns it, right? It kind of all works together. It takes them decades to move the culture. So, yeah, go ahead.
Say, here's
Here,
how,
we're online.
okay, all right. We're online and I got to speak up. I know you guys want to go home and go to sleep, right? Anyway, this bill that I'm going to tell you about was passed unanimously by the state legislature. Unanimously. There was not a single vote against it. And the bill said, you may be a police officer in the state of Utah without being a citizen of the nation. Okay. So does that mean blue helmets are going to be in here next week to do this? The United Nations guide? Not necessarily, but could it be? It could. But here's the deal. The Utah legislature unanimously passed that. And when I went to my representative and said, huh? I said it a little stronger than that. A little stronger than, what the heck are you doing? And how the heck did you come to this conclusion? He said, oh, we were told. We were told that the police agencies were in favor of this. Really? I went to my sheriff and I says, huh? To the sheriff, and reviewed it with the sheriff. And he went, huh? He says, those damn fools, what are they doing? He says, this will never happen in my county. But that's the problem, is if you get non-U.S. people that have no fundamental belief system. They could have just arrived from Somalia. I use that example because of that gal that got killed out in the Midwest by a Somalian immigrant that became a police officer that shot first and asked questions later. It doesn't matter if these people do not have a fundamental belief system that they go to the core with, they can do anything. And indeed, I do believe that the police in Salt Lake City and county favored this bill. But I have not found another police agency anywhere in the state, that doesn't mean I've covered them all, that believes it's right, but they did it without a single dissenting vote. There's another strand of rope around us, if you will, that could be inflexed, and it could be when they bring in the National Guard and other federal agencies. Oh, they're acting as a police agency here. Don't worry about it. We've deputized them. Whatever. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so that's kind of along the same lines of what I thought when I saw this bill. These federal agencies cooperate with the Utah National Guard, and in the bill they did a strikeout on the word Utah. So I thought that was also strange. So now the National Guard from anywhere, right? And so, but the law with police officers who never had a foundation in the Constitution and what our rights are, and then the law, from 2020 that finally snuck in, and we haven't really seen too many like horrible things happening. We just saw a lot of nonsense in games in 2020, but the ropes are being tied, right? And so I would just invite everyone. We have I think we have between our broadcast channels around 40 people online tonight, and we had 80 last week, so it was pretty good. We want to grow these meetings, and then we want to find people inspired to lead in their communities and to just have meetings like this in their communities all across the state, and to increase the knowledge of the Constitution in a practical way, right? This is
like this particular meeting. Can people go back and?
this was on our YouTube channel, so it's
Is there a
the replay as well.
video that they can go, or do they have to know how to do it just on your channel?
We have this up mostly on YouTube, and we have a private members area on our website. Sometimes I upload things to Rumble and BitChute and other channels as well.
If they haven't platforms.
Yeah. So kind of diversified, but we want to take this knowledge, this education that we're having, and spread it into local, private institutions of free men that simply represent their own neighborhoods. And there's principles in this book that talk about your fundamental right to associate, your fundamental right to petition for redress or grievance. These are fundamental rights that we simply have to exercise. And it's simply about having warm bodies, strength in numbers, and learning to educate our neighbors and our and then there's a variety of tips and things on what to do. Okay, that's kind of my point. Is if you're wondering what to do, this book is full of what can I do and different options for different personalities. So anyway, with that said, we'll go ahead and close. And thank you everybody for coming, and thank you everybody online. And we'll get questions right after we close, and we'll wrap it up. So thank you.